So I had a chance to play Callisto Protocol, got a review copy pretty close to release date, so I wasn't able to finish the game, but I'm about like 2/3 of the way into it, I'd say. And yeah, I want to share with you guys what my take is. I did see the reviews, and there's certainly a lot of opinions surrounding it on both ends of the spectrum. Relatively more positive leaning, but yeah, plenty of people are criticizing aspects of the game, and generally people are saying it doesn't quite live up to the hype surrounding the title. As for what my take on it is, well, there are different departments where it does succeed, and then there are some areas where it does kind of fall short. Let's start with the part that really impressed me about this game, the graphics. This is one of the most photorealistic looking games during gameplay that I've seen. The character models in particular are exemplary. I mean, just turning the camera around and looking at the characters' faces, it's crazy just how high fidelity they look, and the environments as well. Just the level of detail that you'll find across the board is really damn impressive from a pure photorealistic standpoint. This is definitely one of the best games I've seen, especially in real time. Cutscenes especially look pretty damn high fidelity, at times photorealistic enough where, you know, it could potentially be a shot from some film. Sometimes the lip sync isn't dead on, so that kind of breaks the illusion a bit. But overall, this is a gorgeous looking game. I do think the art style, if you will, can be a bit generic. You can tell this is like an Unreal Engine game. I think the game can feel a bit monochromatic. I wish there was a bit more color to things, or just something to really distinguish it visually, just give it a unique visual identity. Not only to help with visual variety, but also navigation. It's important to make each room and area feel distinct, so it's easier to know where you are. Sometimes things can look a little too samey. But there are some cool vistas here and there. There are some cool visual design elements that will take you back. Overall, this game is a looker. Now, on the flip side of that, the worst aspect of this game, at least on PC, is the performance. This game stutters a lot, and my rig is pretty modern. I have a 3080 Ti graphics card with one of the latest CPUs. This rig can handle just about any modern AAA game, and Callisto Protocol was struggling, and I wasn't playing at 4K, I was playing at 1440p, and there were segments where it just couldn't hit 60 FPS unless I turned on the AMD FSR 2.0 feature. And in terms of stutters, I think a lot of it had to do with essentially the way it compiles shaders. It felt like when you boot up like a Switch emulator and you play a game for the first time, and you'll see a lot of stutters the first time an asset loads in, or the first time a particle effect plays, anything of the sort like that. Anytime something new is sort of rendered in the game, it stutters. And I think that is shader compilation related. I'm not exactly sure, but this happens a lot. It happened all throughout the game. Even after an update that I got before the game came out, that stuttering continued, and it's something that I've been seeing a lot of reviewers experience, a lot of people who've played the game experience. Apparently the game runs best on PlayStation 5, so maybe get that version if you happen to have a PlayStation 5. But apparently other versions of the game just really have stuttering issues. I experience the same. And it's bad enough that, yeah, it is disruptive, and it sucks that the game shipped this way. Callisto Protocol did put out a statement saying that they're aware of this and that they're working to fix this, but, you know, they could have stood to delay the game a little bit to fix this aspect that, you know, especially for a game that demands so much combat precision, it's important to smooth out that performance. And this includes both gameplay and cutscenes, and it's a shame because the cutscenes really do look gorgeous in this game, and I think the performances overall are pretty solid. I don't think the material that they're given is gonna generate world-class performances or anything, and the story overall is pretty, I don't know, generic feeling, pretty typical, very sort of by the book. I'd say definitely one of the least interesting aspects of this game. The story just really wasn't hooking me. It was typical, you know, corporation trying to hide experiment gone wrong type of thing. Characters really don't have a whole lot of development so far, maybe more towards the end, but, you know, they're just fine. You know, I'm not super invested in the characters. Their dialogue exchanges don't really make me feel like they have really great chemistry or anything. The story's there to justify the gameplay, and the characters are there to drive the momentum of this game, but they didn't really blow me away. Now, the part that's going to be, you know, hit or miss for a lot of people is in the gameplay. combat is something that's been discussed a lot about because so much of the combat in this game is melee-based, and a significant part of that is dodging. And the way you dodge in this game is essentially by pressing the left and right arrow keys, or going left to right in your movement input, and you have to alternate between them in order for subsequent dodges to succeed. So if you dodge left the first time, you have to dodge right the next time. It's about that rhythm. It's almost a bit rhythm game-esque. And then there's this cool feature where once you hit an enemy enough times, you'll see a reticule appear on an enemy. At that point, you can aim and shoot for a quick aim shot. And so a combination of those yields a combat that, yeah, it's very close ranged and often discourages sort of run and gun, if you will, because you're so limited on ammo, and because your limited inventory space means you can't carry a whole bunch of ammo even if you manage to preserve. So it really forces you to take advantage of your baton, your melee attacks, in combination with your ammunition, your guns, your pistols and shotguns and whatnot, so you can preserve as much ammo as possible. But yeah, that dodge mechanic is, I think, where a lot of the division in opinions resides. And I'll be honest with you, me personally, I eventually started to jive with this combat system. There came a point where it did click for me, and I did eventually start dodging pretty well and started pulling off quick aims in really cool fashion, combining that with the sort of force, pull, and push powers that this game grants you to, I don't know, play combat sequences out in a pretty badass feeling way from time to time. Though I do think when multiple enemies get involved, combat can get a bit janky. I do wish that the dodging was not about, you know, which direction you press, but rather there was just a dodge button. I think the fact that it's essentially doubling up both movement and dodging into one input can make it less intuitive than it could be. But beyond that, I do think that combat does have more room to grow, more room to add depth and nuance. It feels like a combat system that is just setting the foundation, and in the sequel, they could really flesh out into something a lot more substantial. I think something they also need to improve on if there is a sequel is enemy variety. That's one area where I think it did mar combat, because a lot of the enemy attack patterns are pretty easy to follow, and they do eventually become repetitive in the pattern that they attack you in. So combat loses that level of engagement because of that lack of enemy variety and attack pattern variety. But in terms of the core mechanics of this combat system, I do think it's going to be a love it or hate it kind of situation. And I don't know, the best way I can describe it is it's akin to like when you first play like Monster Hunter or Dark Souls, where combat at first feels like ass until it eventually clicks with you, and until you kind of start getting the flow of it and the feel of it, and suddenly you're doing really well, and you realize that, yeah, there is skill involved and it is challenging, but once you get used to it, you feel like you earn your victories. You really kind of deliberately did all the actions that granted you that victory. Personally did enjoy how challenging combat was. There were some segments where I had to repeat the sequence a few times to be able to overcome them. You know, essentially memorize where enemies were, memorize their patterns, memorize aspects of the environment that I can exploit. I actually had to have a plan for some of these combat encounters, which is a sensation that I really liked. But there is definitely some clunkiness in the way combat was implemented, with the dodging being tied to your mobility, and with some of the jankiness that can come when there's multiple enemies involved, and the game just doesn't know which direction to look or which direction to dodge and all these things when multiple of them are attacking at the same time. So there's definitely room for refinement. I don't think it's as bad as some people are saying it is. I do think that it is going to be a matter of personal taste and preference. I enjoyed it more than I think a lot of people did, but it's definitely not perfect. It's definitely not as refined as it could be. Now, Dead Space, which this is essentially the spiritual successor of, had the strategic limb shooting kind of combat system that I thought was really cool. This is definitely different from that. Don't expect just Dead Space. You can still shoot limbs and have that yield different effects against enemies. So like if you shoot their legs, they will topple to the ground and it'll stall them and stuff like that. But this combat system is less about, you know, what limb do you want to shoot, and it's more about that, like, close quarters combat with long-range strategizing based on your limited resources. You know, your powers are limited by the amount of battery you have, and your gunplay is limited by the limited ammunition you can carry. And so it's about sort of juggling all of these different limitations while exploiting melee combat as much as possible to preserve the stuff that you're limited on when it comes to resources. So I don't know, to me that sort of interplay felt compelling enough that combat did ultimately appeal to me. And combine that combat with what is overall a suspenseful atmosphere, and I don't know, I was engaged overall. Now, I use the term suspenseful because this game really hasn't scared me yet, per se. You know, they do occasional jump scares, and there are definitely dark areas where you hear these really creepy sounds, and the atmosphere is really cool, but in terms of whether this game is scary, so far for me it hasn't been the case. I don't think the enemy design here is as sort of terrifying as they looked in Dead Space, but they are still gruesome to look at, and this game is gruesome, it is gritty, and it does give you a sense of oppression, but it's also not top-tier horror, if you will. I do think the level design of this game can fall a bit flat, namely because it doesn't offer a whole lot of variety. You're going from point A to point B, occasionally killing a couple enemies, and going after various MacGuffins, and then you're just kind of repeating that cycle over and over again. That cycle is not mixed up with, you know, interesting puzzles or anything like that, cool environmental interactions. It's all just very much go from point A to point B, shoot some stuff, occasionally activate a thing to further the campaign, and then move to point C, rinse and repeat. There are occasional branching paths that takes you to optional rooms where you'll find some valuable loot for resources and the like, be it heals for your health or your battery, or ammunition or currency to buy upgrades in certain specific shops and crafting stations. There are some branching paths which will take you to optional encounters, but nothing super major. And there's nothing wrong with the game being very linear overall, but then they really have to nail the set pieces and the gameplay of those very linear moments. And if there was a lot of enemy variety along the way, and enemy attack patterns changed a lot, and it felt like combat evolved a lot over time, then this could have turned out to be a non-issue for this to be a combat-focused game. But for a game that's so focused on combat, it lacks the variety that can sustain it for the length of this game. Now, this game is roughly 10 to 15 hours. I'd say closer to 10 hours from what I've been hearing. It's not a super long game, so I wouldn't say the gameplay drags out so much that I eventually just felt bored, per se. I just felt like it could have been a more compelling experience from beginning to end if more of that combat variety against enemies was implemented. Combat does get varied up by upgrades, though. You essentially have a shop/sci-fi printing machine that's essentially the crafting table where you can upgrade certain abilities and some of your weapons, whether it be to do more damage or certain new maneuvers and whatnot. So that adds a bit of variety. I did get the sense of progressively feeling more powerful and taking care of enemies quicker and in more varied ways because of new abilities that I obtained, but that didn't overcome the lack of enemy variety and attack patterns that kept combat a bit too monotonous. So what we ultimately have here is, I think, a game that's experiencing first game syndrome, where you've got a lot of great ideas and a solid foundation overall, but a lot of stuff isn't fleshed out enough or refined enough for this to live up to the expectations surrounding it. It's not a home run new IP, but I do think it's a new IP that has the potential to grow. This is definitely one of those games where I'm like, I hope this gets a sequel where they can flesh everything out and refine everything, where they can take the feedback that people are giving them and deliver something that can become a really fantastic and long-running series. For me personally, there was enough here to keep me hooked. I still want to finish this game. I'm not like, all right, I'm tapped out. I still want to keep playing, which is more than can be said for plenty of other games that I've released this year. But I can definitely see why this game's getting mixed reception. I can definitely tell that this game is not going to be Game of the Year material. It's not at that level. But I'd say, I don't know, personally, a solid first entry that just needed a bit more time to hash out the performance issues, and that has ideas that are still developing, that still need a bit more time to marinate. It is a letdown in the sense that it isn't the top-tier game that everyone was expecting, but it's most certainly not this awful thing. It's still overall a pretty decent to good game that just lacks the maturity currently, an enjoyable enough 10 or so hours of sci-fi survival horror gameplay, but nothing here that'll utterly knock your socks off, except for just how gorgeous this game looks. And every once in a while, the game does have some really cool set piece that does make for a visual feast, that does impress. Some really great presentation aspects to this game. But the gameplay, level design, enemy variety, these are areas where it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag. though I'd say a positive-leaning mixed bag. So I think I've covered everything. That's been my experience with the game thus far. I expect that my opinion won't change that much when I finish the last, I don't know, 3 hours or so that I have left with it. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this game once you play it. And with the reviews that are out right now, are you still going to get this game? Is it something that still captures your interest? Or are you much more reserved and wary about checking this game out, maybe waiting for a sale? Let me know what your thought process is throughout all of this in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.